Good morning, everyone. I'll call this meeting of Ways and Means Committee to order. Welcome to the Minnesota House of Representatives. We appreciate your interest and participation in the legislative process. To ensure everyone can view, hear, and understand today's proceedings, we ask for your cooperation in maintaining decorum and civility throughout this hearing. For the safety, security, and comfort of all attendees, please note the following guidelines. I, the committee chair, maintain control of these proceedings and establish the following expectations. Signs and play cards are not permitted in the hearing room. Verbal outbursts, shouting, or disruptive behavior will not be tolerated. Applause or other audible demonstrations are not allowed. For safety reasons, standing or sitting in walkways and aisles or standing or obstructing at your chair is prohibited. If you require any accommodation, please speak with our sergeant staff identified by the gold ties. Troopers and House security personnel are present to ensure everyone's safety. Those providing testimony will be giving specific time limits, which must be strictly observed. If you receive an interest ticket, please retain it, as it may be required for re-entry if you leave the hearing room. Failure to comply with these guidelines may result in a removal from the hearing room. Our goal is to conduct these proceedings efficiently while ensuring everyone the opportunity to observe and participate appropriately. The chair will now outline specific procedure for today's hearing, including the order of testimony and any additional requirements unique to this proceeding. Thank you for your cooperation and participation in the legislative process. I know we've got that out of the way. I will ask for someone to make a motion to approve the minutes from February 23rd, 2026. Chair Torkelson.
So moved, Mr. Chair.
Chair Torkelson moves approval of the minutes for February 23rd. Any discussion? Hearing none, those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed, same sign. Motion to move minutes approved. Today, we have two items on the agenda. We have one bill, House File 3425 by Chair Howard, and then we'll have a preview of the, or a presentation of by MMB of the February forecast. With that said, Chair Howard, please proceed to the testifiers table.
Thank you, Chair Frazier.
Thank you, Chair Howard. Please proceed with House File 3425.
Thank you, Chair Frazier, Chair Torkelson, and members of the committee. Before us in House File 3425, it's always dangerous to say this, but it's a simple bill, but it's an incredibly important bill. And it is vital for the supportive housing providers all across the state that really serve as the backbone of our work to prevent homelessness all across the state of Minnesota. Due to actions at the federal level, the funding for these providers has been severely threatened in a manner that really threatens to upset the apple cart and puts the housing of thousands of our most at-risk Minnesotans in jeopardy. And what this bill does is it utilizes an existing program with a similar role and uses those unspent dollars, provides a little more direction to the state agency and timing to use those dollars for this purpose of our supportive housing providers. That's the overview of what the bill does, but I do want to describe a little bit more in detail what supportive housing providers are, who they are all across the state, and a little bit more background. And when you think about permanent supportive housing providers, these are the trusted providers that are offering not only housing, but the services that are essential for someone that maybe is coming out of homelessness or has a very strong, or has a mental health challenge. And by pairing the services with housing, they're able to help folks stabilize and re-enter to more stable housing. And this type of housing has been working in Minnesota for decades with incredible results. People in supportive housing stay housed and nearly eliminate their use of shelter. We see a positive shift in healthcare use from crisis to preventative care. It also improves child welfare outcomes and less interactions with the judicial system. So it's a cost-effective strategy to reduce homelessness. And unfortunately, these providers are in real danger of having critical federal funding pulled from them. Earlier last year, HUD released guidance that changed funding streams. Minnesota currently receives about $50 million in federal funds to support what are called continuums of care. And within those continuums of care, we have 10 regions all across the state. The largest funding source of that resources is permanent supportive housing because of the track record and how vital these permanent supportive housing providers are all across the state. What HUD has announced is that they're changing midstream the application process and changing priorities away from permanent supportive housing in a way that jeopardizes critical funding for those providers. There were court actions to block this in the near term, which means that housing providers through Q1 and Q2 of this year are very likely to receive their federal funds, but for Q3 and Q4 are very likely not to receive the funds. And for many providers, this federal funding is the lion's share of their funding they receive. There just really isn't capacity if all this money goes away for these providers to keep their doors open. And if they don't keep their doors open, we have hundreds, if not thousands of Minnesotans that will be homelessness. It's that black and white. And so what this bill does is expands the eligible uses for the existing Strengthening the Supportive Housing program in Minnesota. So it comes with no general fund cost. We are just providing more direction for that $9 million to be utilized specifically for permanent supportive housing as an important bridge for these providers as work continues at both the state and federal level to make sure that we stabilize these important entities. Before I move to questions, I want to note that there has been a bipartisan effort in Congress to right this wrong, which I'm supportive of, and this bill has been very bipartisan. I want to thank Co-Chair Igo and members of the Housing Committee for a unanimous vote on this bill. I also want to thank Co-Chair Igo for moving an amendment in committee that increases some reporting functions to have that level of accountability and how these funds are being utilized. We adopted that in committee. So this really is a bipartisan bill that'll have bipartisan impact all across the state of Minnesota. And with that, I'd stand for any questions.
Thank you, Chair Howard. And before we move on to questions from members, I will say that I failed to make a motion at the beginning that I will recommend that House File 3425 be placed on the General Register, and I will renew that after further discussion. Any discussion from members? Chair Torkelson.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Chair. I think it'd be appropriate if, I know we've already stated that there's no fiscal impact, but I'd like House Fiscal to outline the fiscal impacts of the bill.
House Fiscal.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members. So as Representative Howard mentioned, the implications of this bill is just to amend the way that the existing appropriation can be used. So in 2024 laws, the appropriation was changed to $10 million for supportive housing, and that amount has not changed. So with this language, that $10 million can be used for these grants that the chair outlined in his testimony.
Thank you. Rep. Igo.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Co-Chair Howard, for the bill. Just was going to speak to its importance again through the research I've done when this issue first came up. I'm still hoping we're going to see a federal change on it. There's been a lot of good push from Republicans and Democrats working with HUD to try and iron this out. The idea behind the change was to get more to giving people that hand up with the continuum of care, getting people the services they need, which many of the continuums of care that we have in the state of Minnesota do work on that. But there is folks in our communities that will always need that level of support. And that's what this bill is going to be going in there to help. It's those folks with mental illness, those folks with substance abuse, those folks with TBIs that we're going to be taking care of so that they're not being taken care of by law enforcement in our ERs. They have a place they can call home and we can take care of them in the state of Minnesota. And that agreement was struck between the federal government and state government for a while. Again, that change, I think, where it sounds right and is good, and I think most people would agree with it, had unforeseen circumstances to it. So this is a right motion for us to go right now to fix this gap while we continue to work on the federal level. And, you know, again, thank our federal delegation as well for a bipartisan effort to try and fix this. So I do support this bill and have be a co-author.
Thank you, Chair Igo. Chair Gomez.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I appreciate just the support for this approach. It is, you know, if you look at what helps those people in our communities who are struggling with persistent mental illness, substance use disorder. It's just precisely this model, which, provides on-site services and supports to ensure that in addition to having, a roof over their heads, that people have the support needed to stay in the housing. I'm just, this is maybe just sort of a technical question. Why is it that the legislature appropriated, initially $25 million to this program in 2023, according to the summary from House Research, which was then subsequently lowered to $10 million. But why is it February 2026 and the money that we appropriated to this program in 2023 to Minnesota Housing hasn't made it out into the communities yet?
Chair Howard, if you can.
Chair Frazier, Representative Gomez, I don't want to speak for the State Finance Agency. I would note that we did have a historic 2023 bill, and the volume of the resources and programs that were asked to set up, what the agency has said is that has taken time. I think all of us would have liked that to move a little more quickly to get resources into the system. This was a program, a new program brought to us by the State Finance Agency. And I do appreciate their willingness to be flexible with these resources that are still available. This is a similar use. And so in some ways, we're fortunate that we have this lever to pull in this moment of crisis. But I don't want to discount your question, which is that it has been 2.5+ years, and it is true that this program hasn't really been implemented or fully stood up yet.
Any follow-up, Chair Gomez? Chair Claiborne?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. My question is, because this is talking about entities whose contracts have expired or will expire by the end of this year, I'm supportive of the programming, right? So I'm not questioning the program. I'm just wondering how many entities fall into this category?
Chair Howard?
Co-Chair Frazier, Representative Cleaborn, I don't have the exact numbers in front of me, but it's dozens and dozens. Basically, most of our supportive housing providers all across the state have contracts with HUD to do this work. And so what that referencing is that if those contracts are stalled out, which is what the federal government had announced and is likely to occur in Q3, Q4, they would be eligible for these resources. But I can get that exact number to you.
Any follow-up?
Yeah, my question is, if their contracts have expired, with all of the other types of re-vetting and I don't even know what else to call it, from the federal government, will all of these entities that have had their contracts expire, will they have to go through a new vetting process in order to qualify for these funds?
Chair Howard?
Co-Chair Frazier, Representative Cleaborn, that was what they were preparing for when the federal government made this announcement. And not only have to reapply for these funds, but reapply for a drastically reduced pot for supportive housing. So you'd see providers having to make this choice. Are we going to apply for these funds and completely change our model that we know that's working and keeping people safe? Or not. And so it kind of forces this impossible choice, which is why, to Co-Chair Igo's point, we'd like to see, a fix or a change at the congressional level. But these resources provide a little more runway if providers are in that place where they either have to reapply for a program they don't want to run or choose not to reapply because they know that they're not going to get the funds.
Chair Claiborne?
Thank you, Chair. Then the last question is, how long will this $9 million be available, right? So it says the section is effective following enactment, but it doesn't say when the funds, at least I don't see it. When do they expire?
Chair Howard?
Co-Chair Frazier, Representative Cleaborn, I don't think we include a timing mechanism. I will note it says the agency will coordinate with stakeholders on a distribution process established within 30 days of enactment. We do that, and the overall subtext here is that speed is our friend, that these providers are going to face this big financial cliff. And so while we didn't put an exact trigger, you need to have these funds expended by X, the conversation and some of the subtext here, we would anticipate that the funds would get expended fairly quickly within this year.
Any follow-up, Chair Claiborne?
No, thank you very much, Chair.
Chair Kosnick.
Thank you. Chair Howard, can you help me identify the difference of the $1 million from what was appropriated to the amount that's being used for the grants? And then the second question is, the use of the funds, will this be 50-50 Metro outstate, or is that allocated in there?
Chair Howard.
Co-Chair Frazier, Representative Kosnick. The agency may be better addressed to the exact specifics. I do know that they have used some resources of their 10 million allocation for planning purposes as they prepared and had been preparing to utilize this resource in a similar, if not exact, function. In terms of, we don't call out specifically an allocation, but I would say that there are the providers, the continuum of care networks are statewide. And so I would very much expect a geographic distribution based on need and based on who applies for the funds. But so the needs are really statewide.
Chair Kosnick, any follow-up?
Thank you. I guess I'd be a little bit more comfortable if it was actually in the bill that a certain allocation was to be dispersed throughout the state rather than just hoping. And obviously, there's $10 million minus $9 million equals $1 million that's not identified. I understand that's probably for administration, and I guess I'm not real comfortable with that either.
Chair Howard.
I guess I would say, Chair Kosnick, the agency's had a good track record of deploying the resources based on the need. To me, that should be the metric. Where the needs are the greatest, that's where we should deploy the resources. We shouldn't come up with just some arbitrary percentage. That doesn't strike me as good policy. But I would say that based on our conversations, I expected geographic dispersion because there are great supportive housing providers that are in need all across the state.
Chair Gomez.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I guess I just, want people to be clear-eyed about what the homelessness response system across the state looks like, which is that it is not, it's not geographically dispersed in a 50-50 way. It's interesting to me, though, because, if you talk to Ramsey County in particular, Hennepin County, up in the percentage of, 40 to, in Hennepin, to over 50% of the people who are served by the emergency homelessness response in Ramsey County are not from Ramsey County. And in part, that speaks to the lack of development of some of those systems across the state. And so especially in these, and the co-chairs of the Housing Committee will be really familiar with this, it's sort of like, this balance between responding to the most immediate need as it exists right now, which would mean that most of the money would go to the Metro, and a commitment to building up those systems around the state so that people can, should they be in the unfortunate position of experiencing homelessness, especially with children, that they would be able to stabilize in their home communities, because we know that, if people can stay close to, their communities, their churches, their kids' schools, their families, that, that can provide this sort of web of support around them. But a lot of times what we see is families in the most dire circumstances having to leave their communities, come to the Metro, which is why you see that, greater concentration and utilization of services there. And thus you could say there's more need there. But this is just a balance that, housing people, for sure, the housing agency are trying to strike. And so, I think that it's sort of a, it's the kind of thing that I understand that it's tempting to sit here at this table and say, oh, we should tell them exactly what percentage of funds we want to go here and there. But it's a little bit more of a kind of, it requires a more careful analysis, I think, than that sort of blunt impulse that some of us have. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair Gomez. Chair Howard, would you like to add anything to that?
No.
Thank you. Any further discussion? Chair Igo.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm just going to make a comment. In our packets, members, there is the Continuum of Care Program funding awards amounts. I was trying to do quick math to give a percentage breakdown, but roughly of the dollars that go out for grand totals, it's a little over 30 million goes to the 7-county metro area. The rest does go to greater Minnesota. So if you apply that for what kind of programs are going to be going for this 9 million, you are going to see an even split. I will kind of go on with what Chair Gomez was talking about, that yes, there's more established programming in the 7-county metro, but the 7-county metro also has more supportive through other nonprofits and other government entities that help them, whereas greater Minnesota, sometimes their HUD contract is their only source of funding. So as these programs are going to be coming, they will be evaluated by need, and that is going to be contributed. So, yes, sometimes it isn't always a 50-50 split, but the needs are going to be different, and that's how this program will be given out per the legislation. So I just wanted to add that. Thank you.
Thank you. Any further discussion? Chair Howard, any closing comments?
I'll just be very brief. I really thank the committee for moving quickly and hearing this important bill, and know that by moving forward with speed, it gives a peace of mind to these permanent supportive housing providers that wake up every day doing this amazing work and are wondering if they can continue doing this amazing work in their committee. So I appreciate the discussion and encourage members' support of House File 3425.
With that, with no further discussion, I will renew my motion that House File 3425 be recommended for placement on the General Register. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, same sign.
No.
The motion prevails, and House File 3425 is recommended for placement on the General Register. Thank you, Chair Howard.
Thank you.
Up next, we will have a presentation from MMB. Testifiers, please make your way to the table. Welcome, Commissioner Campbell. When you're ready, please proceed.
Good morning, Mr. Chair and members. I'm Minnesota Management and Budget Commissioner Erin Campbell. With me today are State Economist Dr. Anthony Becker and our State Budget Director Anna Minke, and we're going to be presenting the February 2026 Budget and Economic Forecast. As a reminder, Minnesota is one of 13 states that show a 4-year window into our state's budget and economic outlook in our twice-yearly forecasts. That enables us to not only gauge near-term economic conditions, but also to plan for circumstances that may arise in the next biennium. We're analyzing a large amount of data when we're developing our forecasts, and the forecasts represent the best financial projections that we can provide based on the information available when we prepare them. In this forecast, we continue to refine our projections for fiscal years 26 and 27, which will provide essential information that policymakers can use in any supplemental budget considerations. We also update our projections for the planning years FY 28 and 29. And after our presentation, we'll be happy to take your questions. There is good news in this forecast, but significant risks remain. Minnesota's in a strong financial position. We now project to end fiscal years 26 and 27 with a surplus of $3.7 billion. That is 1.3 more than we had forecasted in November. Left unspent, that surplus carries forward into fiscal years 28 and 29. Those funds carrying forward are key to ending the planning years with a positive balance. As a result, we're currently forecasting a $377 million positive balance in FY 28 and 29. The increased projected balance in both biennia is due to a slightly improved national economic outlook that drives an increase in forecast revenues, particularly in individual income tax and corporate franchise taxes. When it comes to individual income tax revenues, we are seeing a shift from typical drivers of revenue increases, like wage and salary, to more volatile sources. Higher wages and more people in the workforce traditionally drive increases in revenues from individual income taxes. And wages do, in fact, continue to rise. However, employment growth in both nationally and here in Minnesota are weak, and demographics and changing immigration policies, are shrinking the pool of available workers. Instead, what we're seeing now is that capital gains and interest earnings, which are sensitive to even small changes in the national economic outlook, propel much of the forecasted increase in individual income tax revenues. As Minnesota becomes more reliant on these revenue sources, we're also seeing and should expect some increased volatility. As we've discussed in previous forecasts, we've also seen unprecedented growth in corporate tax revenues. And while this is good news, it's worth noting that this has long been our most volatile revenue source. Dr. Becker will discuss this in more detail, but the lack of access to relevant federal data due to the federal government shutdown does have potential implications for our revenue forecast, particularly when it comes to these volatile revenue sources. In Minnesota, we're also seeing unprecedented threats to the federal funding that we rely on. Any loss of federal funding is problematic, but particularly for entitlements, where it would result in significantly increased costs for the state to provide legally required services without the benefit of federal aid. The potential implications for the Minnesota budget should not be underestimated. And the structural imbalance, or the amount that spending exceeds revenues, continues to be an issue in this biennium and the next, even after the improvements in the revenue forecast. I do want to note that the significant actions taken by the governor and the legislature last spring in the enacted FY 26-27 budget have helped drive a positive balance in FY 28 and 29. And while the structural imbalance was not eliminated, it is improved in part due to those budget decisions. This slide shows a projected FY 26-27 budgetary balance for this forecast in the middle column compared to the November forecast on the left. The column furthest to the right shows the difference between the two. At the top of the slide, you can see that our beginning balance for the current biennium is nearly $10.3 billion. That money represents carry forward from the last biennium. Our revenue estimates for the current biennium are up $1.2 billion from the November forecast, and spending projections are down $68 million. The projected balance at the end of fiscal years 26-27 appears under the lowest horizontal line. As you can see, we now forecast a positive balance of more than $3.7 billion, again, $1.3 billion more than we had forecast in November. This next slide should look familiar. It shows the forecast horizon and the impacts of one biennium on the next. We show this slide to help folks understand how money moves from one biennium to the next. Before I get to the contents of the slide, it is important to remember that when we started this current biennium in July, we had the benefit of significant carry forward from FY 24 and 25, $4.8 billion. This is important because we do have a structural imbalance in the biennium that we are currently in of $908 million. That starting balance less the structural imbalance leaves us with a projected balance of $3.7 billion. So if you're looking at the slide, let's start with the column in dark blue furthest to the left. This shows the $3.7 billion that we project will be available at the end of the current biennium, fiscal years 26 and 27. Left unspent, that amount would carry forward to become the beginning balance in the FY 28 and 29 biennium. If we move to the middle column in gold, you can see the projected structural imbalance in FY 28-29, totaling just under $3.4 billion. This is the amount the projected spending will exceed revenues generated in that biennium, as well as discretionary inflation of over $1 billion. When you subtract that sum from the $3.7 billion beginning balance, we're left with what you see in the dark blue column on the right, $377 million at the end of fiscal years 28 and 29. Discretionary inflation is included in the forecast to give policymakers a sense of what it would cost to maintain state services at current levels. If we do not count discretionary inflation, and as a reminder, legislators are not required to budget for that, we would have a projected positive balance of slightly more than $1.4 billion at the end of the planning years. With that, I'd like to invite State Economist Dr. Becker to cover our economic and revenue outlook.
Dr. Becker,
Thank you.
introduce yourself for the record. Proceed.
Thank you, Chair Frazier. Chair Torkelson, members, thank you, Commissioner Campbell. I'm Anthony Becker, Minnesota State economist. Since Minnesota's budget and economic forecast was last prepared in November 25, the state's revenue forecast for the current and next biennia have improved due to changes in the Minnesota and U.S. economic outlooks. However, at the same time, these changes and long-term trends in the composition of state revenues have increased the volatility of the state's revenue stream. Further, weak labor market conditions and federal policy uncertainty on trade and tariffs add uncertainty that continues to cloud the economic outlook. Our macroeconomic consultant, S&P Global Market Intelligence, SPGMI, released their baseline forecast to us on February 6th of this year. Due to the federal government shutdown in October and November and the partial shutdown in early February, certain key pieces of data that are typically available for SPGMI's February forecast were not available to them. The data include the fourth quarter 25 release on gross domestic product and its components, including corporate profits, the January 2026 employment situation report, and consumer prices in October 25. On trade, SPGMI assumed an effective tariff rate of 14%, 4 percentage points lower than in November. The recent Supreme Court decision invalidating the IEEPA tariffs happened after SPGMI's forecast, as did the administration's new 10% Section 122 tariffs. In this next chart, we have SPGMI's forecast for gross domestic product through the end of the forecast period. Here, the overall outlook has improved since November, with higher growth in 25, slightly higher growth in 26, mostly due to an assumption that strong economic growth in quarters 3 and 4 of 2025 would carry forward. As in November, GDP growth remains below trend in 2027 and beyond. This means that employment demand is unlikely to be robust in the years ahead. Further, a low-growth economy can more easily slip into recession as the result of an adverse external shock. Real personal consumption expenditures, also referred to as real consumer spending, are the primary driver of growth in the economy, as consumption accounts for roughly 70% of gross domestic product. SPGMI now forecasts real consumer spending will grow 2.8% in 2026, 0.7 percentage points higher than in November. From 2027 through 2029, real consumer spending is expected to grow 2.2% per year on average. Despite rising incomes, we are observing some signs of consumer stress, with higher delinquency rates in certain loans, credit cards, auto loans, and student loans. Delinquency rates in these three areas are reaching levels comparable to those during the Great Recession. However, home loan delinquency rates remain at historic low levels. Compared to the November forecast, inflation is projected to be slightly lower in 2026 and higher from 2027 through 2029. Lower near-term inflation reflects a lower assumed average effective tariff rate than was assumed in November, and lower inflation that we experienced in late 2025. Overall, inflation in both the CPI and core personal consumption expenditure indices is expected to remain elevated through 2027 before gradually easing in 2028. Corporate profits are now expected to grow 9.5% in fiscal year 2026, 7.4 percentage points stronger than projected in November. In fiscal year 27 and beyond, corporate profits are forecast to show minimal growth. Minnesota's corporate franchise tax is closely related to the level of corporate profits and is the state's most volatile revenue source. The volatility of this revenue source makes it difficult to forecast with precision. Minnesota's unemployment rate has continued to increase over the past year, both absolutely and relative to the national rate. In December, Minnesota's unemployment rate was 4.1%, up 1.1 percentage points from a rate of 3.0% 1 year ago. Although the unemployment rate has risen, Minnesota's rate remains below the national rate, and the state's job market remains favorable to job seekers with more vacancies than unemployed workers. And while this forecast does not include a recession, we are following labor market conditions closely, as some labor market indicators send early signals of economic contractions and expansions. A significant driver of our individual income tax forecast is the forecast for total wage and salary disbursements, and it has changed little since November. In this forecast, increases in wages and salaries is not a main driver of the increase in individual income tax revenue we forecast. Rather, the increase is driven by increases in non-wage income, principally capital gains distributions, which vary much more year to year than does wage income. SPGMI's forecast of the S&P 500 stock index is one determinant of our forecast for non-wage income. Their February forecast is substantially higher than their November forecast for the S&P 500. In November, they were projecting a 12% multi-year downward correction in the index, with the market declining through late 2028. The current forecast assumes a milder correction of only 4% and recovery beginning in 2027. This higher level of the S&P 500 translates into higher wealth for households. Higher wealth will lead to higher capital gains realizations, and this is causing much of the increase we are forecasting in state income tax revenues. Equity markets present both upside and downside risks for this forecast. If equity markets continue their current upward trend, we will see greater levels of consumer spending and higher non-wage income, both of which will increase state revenues. On the other hand, if we see a substantial decrease in market values, both income and spending would likely fall. So turning to the revenue forecast. The first two columns show the February forecast for the current biennium and the change compared to November. The second set of columns show the same information for the planning years. Total revenues for the current biennium are now forecast to be almost $68 billion, 1.8% more than in the November forecast. We're now projecting individual income tax receipts to be 1.9% more than we projected in November. This increase is primarily due to higher forecasts for individual income tax liability in tax years 25 and 26. The higher tax liability forecast is largely driven by higher forecasts for non-wage income sources, such as capital gains realizations, interest income, and IRA distributions. Through January 2026, individual estimated tax payments for tax year 25 are well above our November forecast, which is consistent with a higher tax year 25 liability. Technical adjustments and higher forecasts for net partnership and S corporation collections further contribute to the forecast change, and this is consistent with stronger net collections we've observed through January. General sales tax revenues now forecasted to be almost $16 billion, or 0.5% more in the current biennium than in the November forecast. The increased forecast reflects higher forecasts for consumer spending on goods and services subject to the sales tax. The corporate franchise tax is forecast to generate $6.6 billion in the current biennium, 5.4% more revenue than in the November forecast. This forecast change is due to the higher corporate profits forecast as shown previously. Other revenues are now forecast to generate almost $10 billion, just over 1% more than in the November forecast, due primarily to an increased forecast for investment income, the return the state earns on its cash balances, including the budget reserve. Now, as I noted previously, higher forecasts for non-wage income sources are primary drivers of the higher individual income tax forecast. The non-wage share of gross income reported by Minnesota taxpayers has been increasing over time, and we expect this trend to continue. Non-wage income sources such as capital gains and interest income are more variable from year to year than our wage and salary income. As the proportion of personal income tax coming from more volatile sources rises, the overall volatility of income tax collection also rises. Further, over time, the proportion of general fund revenues coming from the more volatile corporate franchise tax has also risen. The overall effect is that the volatility of the state's revenue stream is increasing. Now, there are many risks to this forecast. First among them is the policy uncertainty at the federal level, especially regarding trade, tariffs, and immigration. Trade uncertainty may induce businesses and consumers to take on less debt, suppressing both private investment and some forms of consumer spending. Tariffs are mostly passed through to domestic buyers and so also contribute to higher prices and higher input costs for businesses. The administration's immigration policies also produce forecast risk through the potential to create labor shortages in business sectors dependent on immigration for new workers. The recent federal shutdown disrupted the usual collection and dissemination of federal statistical data, as previously discussed. Corporate profits, inflation, and labor market conditions are all adding uncertainty to our revenue forecast. It also makes it more difficult to assess the reasonableness of SPGMI's forecasts of inflation and exchange rates. Equity markets present both upside and downside risks, as I have already mentioned. The assumed path of monetary policy depends on both inflation and labor market conditions. Because of trade uncertainty and weak national employment growth, there is limited clarity about monetary policy through the forecast horizon. The adoption of artificial intelligence provides both upside and downside risks. The upside or positive risk is that higher levels of capital investment and increased labor productivity will raise the nation's output. The downside risks include the possibility of job losses from AI adoption, and that there is an AI investment bubble which may burst. Finally, there are 17 months remaining until the end of the current biennium, and it is difficult to forecast macroeconomic conditions with great precision a year and a half ahead. I'll now turn the presentation over to State Budget Director Anna Mingy.
Director Mingy, please introduce yourself and proceed.
Good morning, Mr. Chair. I'm Anna Mingy, State Budget Director with Minnesota Management and Budget. Today, I'll be walking through changes in the general fund forecast for state spending before turning it back to the Commissioner, who will discuss our long-term budget outlook. This table outlines anticipated changes in general fund spending in the current biennium as well as the next. This is a format that you may be used to seeing from us, again, every forecast. In total, if you look at the very bottom line, we project general fund spending will be $70.2 billion this biennium, $68 million less than our previous estimates. The planning years have increased slightly by $152 million since our last forecast. So let's walk through the table to describe what's causing this change. The first line, E12 education, spending is projected to be $111 million higher this biennium and $257 million higher in the next relative to November estimates. These increases are a result of higher spending on special education, where costs have grown as school districts spend more on compensation and benefits to serve a growing number of students. I will discuss this in more detail on a later slide. The next line, Health and Human Services spending, is projected to be lower than previous estimates, in this case by $162 million in the current biennium and $199 million in the next. This reduction is largely driven by the implementation of a new prepayment review process for select medical assistance benefits, which I'll discuss in greater detail on a later slide. On the next line, you can see spending for property tax aids and credits is $18 million lower than previous estimates this biennium. Then debt service and all other areas of the state budget are relatively unchanged from the November forecast. The last line I'd highlight is the spending estimate for discretionary inflation, which we include in all biennia for which we don't have an enacted budget, which in this case is just 2028 and 2029. We estimate the cost of discretionary inflation to be $1.039 billion, which is $104 million more than we forecast in November. Because inflation is applied on a relatively large base, a small fluctuation in the consumer price index can drive a change of $100 million. As a reminder, this number is meant to be a guide for policymakers about the cost of maintaining current services as prices grow. It's important to emphasize this money doesn't automatically flow to state programs. Any increases would need to be appropriated by the legislature. So you all have the choice of whether or not to appropriate this funding to address inflationary pressures. So next, I will move on and discuss some of the key changes and trends within the spending forecast. As you just heard, special education costs are responsible for the upward revision in our education forecast. Special ed alone has increased by $112 million this biennium and $350 million in the next since our previous forecast. This growth is on top of significant increases that we saw in the November forecast. We now have complete data about what schools spent on special ed services in the 2024 and 2025 school year. School special ed spending grew by 10% last year over the previous year, compared to the 6% that we assumed in the November forecast. The annual rate of growth for school spending has grown significantly in recent years, driving revisions in the special ed forecast. The chart on the screen in front of you shows actual and forecast state general fund special ed spending from 2020 through 2029. The solid line across the top represents our current forecast. You can see that over this time period, we project special ed will grow from $1.6 billion in 2020 to $3.6 billion by 2029. From 2020 through 2023, state special ed spending grew on average about 5% a year. But in this forecast, it's projected to grow about 9.5% a year from 2025 through 2029. While some of this change can be attributed to policy changes enacted by the legislature, overall growth in local education agency spending continues to rise forecast over forecast. And what you see on the slide is that the dashed and dotted lines show previous estimates of special ed forecasts. So at the very bottom was the 2023 end of session estimates. The next line was 2025 end of session estimates, and then the dashed green line was what we projected in the November 2025 forecast. So now I'll move on and talk about changes on the Health and Human Services side. As I mentioned, this forecast is the first to incorporate experience from a new prepayment review process for select medical assistance benefits. In late October 2025, the Minnesota Department of Human Services announced a new process to suspend and review claims for 14 specific Medicaid benefits before they were paid. This was intended to provide additional time to identify suspicious patterns and anomalies. DHS contracted with a third party for the review and has established an ongoing prepayment review process for these services. Now, this process impacts the forecast in 3 ways.
That's a really good question.
The most immediate impact is the new review process results in a delay in the payment of these fee-for-service claims for a single 2-week billing cycle. This results in a one-time savings of $53 million in the current biennium relative to the November forecast. The most significant and ongoing impact of the prepayment review process comes from providers billing less, which can also be referred to as cost avoidance. Through an analysis of claims from before and then during the implementation of prepayment review, the Department of Human Services estimates that there will be about 4% lower spending in the 14 services as a result of providers billing less. This cost avoidance is expected to decrease state spending by $75 million this biennium and $99 million next biennium. This estimate is based on actual experience in the most recent quarter and is not an explicit measure of fraud, but it may indicate a deterrent effect of the new prepayment review process. It may also capture some savings related to broader economic conditions that are driving billing activity for these services. The third forecast impact, which is the smallest but is notable, is the denial of claims that would have been otherwise paid if not for the new prepayment review process. With this process, claims for impacted benefits are reviewed using targeted analytics, and if a claim is flagged for further review, it's sent to DHS staff who reviews it and decides whether or not to approve the claim. Based on early data, DHS projects an increase in denials, which reduces state spending by $5 million this biennium and $6 million in the next, relative to where we were in the November forecast. So in total, the incorporation of this new data lowers the spending forecast by $133 million this biennium and $105 million in the next. So next, I want to spend a moment discussing something that is not reflected in the forecast, but that's important for policymakers such as yourselves to be tracking. As you all understand, federal funds are a very important piece of the state budget. More than 1 in every $3 spent by state agencies comes from the federal government. MMB pays particular attention to federal funding streams that support state-level entitlements. And this is because these are state obligations that our laws say we have to provide to Minnesotans regardless of federal funding levels. We estimate that these programs make up 2/3 of the funds we receive from the federal government. In these cases, the loss of federal funds create a direct budgetary impact to the state. Federal funding for entitlement programs has been more volatile in recent months as a result of both administrative action and federal law change. And there are a number of outstanding risks that aren't reflected in our spending forecast today. One of those is related to actions taken by the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, also known as CMS. This is the federal agency that oversees our medical assistance program. On January 6th, CMS indicated their intent to withhold $515 million in federal reimbursement. That action is currently pending appeal, and any budgetary impacts of that are not reflected in the forecast. Also, earlier last week, we received additional notice from CMS that they would defer or pause $260 million in Medicaid reimbursements pending further information from the state to justify claims flagged by the federal government. Any loss of federal funds resulting from that deferral process is also not reflected in the budget today. There is also budgetary risk from state laws not aligning with changes made to federal law. H.R. 1, the Federal Reconciliation Bill, made a number of changes, some of which must be implemented by states by January 1 of 2027. An example of this is the implementation of Medicaid work reporting requirements. If state law is not amended to align with this change, we stand to lose significant federal funds supporting our medical assistance program. There have also been recent attempts by the federal government to freeze funds supporting childcare and MFIP cash benefits, which, if they were to go forward, would also impact the general fund forecast. Although none of these impacts are currently reflected, if they were to occur, it would alter our budget outlook. With that, I will turn it back to the Commissioner to discuss our budget outlook.
Go ahead, Commissioner.
Thank you, Anna. This slide shows the long-term budget outlook. It compares our forecast revenues against our estimated spending for the current biennium and the next, and that's without including unspent projected balances or transfers to the budget reserve. It's what we call our structural balance. As you can see, forecast revenues of $67.5 billion in the current biennium are expected to grow by $2.5 billion in the next, an annualized growth rate of 1.9%. During that same period, we're expecting baseline spending of $68.4 billion to increase by nearly $4 billion, or 2.9% on an annualized basis for that biennium. If you include appropriation carry forward and discretionary inflation, total spending is projected to exceed $70.2 billion in this biennium and grow $3.1 billion to a total of $73.4 billion for the planning years, an annualized growth rate of 2.2%. If we take a step back, when we subtract total forecast spending in the planning biennium from expected revenues in that same period, you end up with a structural imbalance of nearly $3.4 billion, or $2.3 billion if you don't count discretionary inflation. So despite tremendous progress, more work is needed to address the ongoing structural imbalance to align revenues and spending. You can see on this slide how our budget reserves have grown over the years, thanks to our nation-leading reserve policy. With the addition of $244 million last November, our total cash flow and budget reserve funding remains at a record high of $3.8 billion. Those reserve dollars not only protect us against an unexpected loss of revenues in the current biennium, they also help us to maintain our AAA bond ratings and our reputation as a financially well-managed state. As I close, I want to reinforce that the state of Minnesota is on strong financial footing. We have a very healthy projected balance in FY 26-27 of nearly $3.7 billion on the bottom line. And despite persistent structural imbalance, we expect to end this biennium and the next with a positive balance, and that's a big improvement from November, particularly in FY 28 and 29. Additionally, we have our nation-leading automatic allocation to the reserves, which means we have funds to address an unexpected revenue shortfall should one occur in the current biennium. Just a note here that in light of Minnesota's increased dependence on more volatile revenue sources, there may be adjustments needed to the budget reserve target level to better capture those heightened risks. We also have our AAA bond ratings that demonstrate rating agencies' continued confidence in Minnesota's responsible financial management, as well as our history of taking actions to keep the state on sound financial footing. And we do have time to work on the structural changes needed to bring spending and revenues in line to avoid a future fiscal cliff. Still, it will be important to policymakers to keep a few things in mind as they make decisions this legislative session. First, the volatility of revenues driving the forecast improvement. And this is in particularly in light of relevant macroeconomic data that did not arrive in time to be included in the forecast. Even the most recently released GDP and corporate profits data could have had meaningful impacts on the available revenues. As we've mentioned, continued federal funding uncertainty could have impacts on the general fund bottom line. And we know that any new spending in this biennium will impact the projected positive balance of $377 million in FY '28 and '29. Finally, structural imbalance does continue to be an issue. Alignment of spending and revenues will need to be addressed. The sooner we begin looking for additional ways to do that, the less likely we are to face that future fiscal cliff. Given these considerations, it'd be MMB's recommendation that policymakers should, at a minimum, strongly consider offsetting any new spending with spending reductions to be mindful of both the FY '28 and '29 projected balance and structural imbalance. I do want to once again acknowledge the important work that was done last legislative session that did have a material impact on this forecast. That fiscal discipline will remain important in this legislative session and the next. As always, MMB will continue to watch for significant changes through monthly revenue updates, our quarterly economic updates, close monitoring of federal actions, and we'll be providing the information that legislators need to anticipate and respond to economic changes. And with that, we're happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Commissioner. I will ask the first question. You mentioned the nation-leading reserve policy that we have. Where do we stand? Do you know, are you able to give information, where do we stand in terms of the rest of the nation in terms of our reserve compared to others?
Chair Frazier, I don't know if we have that information readily available today. Do you know that answer?
Mr. Chair, I think there are different measures to respond to the question, where do we stand?
Yep.
One that is used by our rating agencies is percentage of general fund revenues. And in that measure, I would say we're sort of in the middle of the pack. But, and we can follow up with the specifics with the committee. I would say that what is special about Minnesota's budget reserve is that we base our percentage on revenue volatility rather than a blunt percentage to ensure that we are sort of guarding against risk, but also that resources are sort of available to you all to respond to other pressures.
Thank you. And I see we do have a couple of members on the list. Chair Claiborne.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And you know, this really has to do with your slide 13. And it's the S&P 500 stock index slide. So over the weekend, we saw with the announcement of the war in Iran that hit our market really hard, which would impact capital gains very quickly. We also know with the investments in AI, they're tying up capital that could be used in our manufacturing markets or in our housing markets. So we don't know really what that impact is going to be. I mean, it looks like there's a lot of volatility in those commercial markets that way. I'm wondering, so with all of these pieces that are truly up in the air, I heard you say loud and clear, and I appreciate it, offset spending, right, which is a very prudent recommendation. But at the same time, I'm wondering, I know we usually get a forecast in the fall and a forecast in this time of the year. Is there any consideration of updating this and getting it back to us again before we sign off on a final budget? I don't know what the history is for that.
Commissioner.
Chair Frazier, Chair Claiborne, so at this point, no, we would not have planned to update the forecast. The the only other time I am aware of that we've done that, it frankly wasn't particularly accurate, and we don't think it would be a very useful exercise. Having said that, the way we would help inform policymakers' decisions is in a few ways. If it was a loss of federal funding, we would know what that actual dollar amount would be, and we can do the math on that. Similarly, we are always watching our monthly revenue updates, and we would have a sense of whether, how revenues are comparing to forecast, and whether or not that was resulting in a cause for concern, and would certainly be communicating that to all of you.
Any follow-up, Chair Claiborne?
Just a very quick thank you. Your team does an amazing job, and I really appreciate all of the work that you do. And I remember speaking to you before you went into your bond rating meetings, and I just want to thank you for all the great work that you put into that to ensure that we continue to have that AAA rating. Very important. Thank you.
Chair Torkelson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm not sure who wants to answer this. The first question I have has to do with special ed, the rather dramatic increases there. Can you give a little more information onto what's driving that? I think you mentioned legislative changes, but it's also student numbers or cost per student. What's going on there?
Whoever wants to take it, go ahead.
Sure, I'll take that, Mr. Chair, Chair Torkelson. So special education is largely a cost-based, like reimbursement-driven formula. And there are two things happening. Special ed is both growing over time and costs are growing forecast to forecast. The special education forecast spending is up because prior year spending is up. Fiscal year 2025 saw the largest single year increase in spending since moving to the new special ed formula back in 2015. So the significant majority of special ed spending is on staff payroll and fringe costs. And some things we have been seeing is wages wage growth has been higher than historic trends in recent years. And then also the costs for benefits are increasing. And that is not, the rising cost of insurance and healthcare is something that's happening sort of globally across Minnesota and across the country. So I think that is something that we are seeing in our special ed reimbursement as well. Another major driver is an increase in special ed transportation costs, which are often provided by sort of third-party contractors and reimbursed at a higher percentage to districts than some of the other special ed services. And then the last thing I note is there is a service called the Alternative Delivery of Specialized Instruction Services, which is mostly staffing costs. But in that case, we've also seen a fairly significant increase in applications from year to year. And we are happy to follow up with additional information.
Chair Torkelson, any follow-ups?
Not at this time, Mr. Chair, but thank you for that answer. I think it's one of these issue areas that we need to pay close attention to. I'm going to jump to a different area, if I may.
Go ahead,
Chair. As we move forward with this session, we're going to be wrestling with what seems to me two very important issues. One being compliance, things like work requirements, et cetera, and the other being the potential for tax conformity. I realize your work today did not include either of those in the numbers that you have presented, but do any of you have some information that you have garnered in your work that might inform our efforts in these two very important areas?
Commissioner?
Mr. Chair, Chair Torkelson, so we do not know the impact yet of if we were to not conform to, or comply rather, with HR 1 in the human services space. We do not yet know what the financial impact could be. We know the total cost of the program, and so we know sort of like, on at the extreme end what that would be, but we don't have a sense yet what the specific penalty for that would be. We do know that we are supposed to comply with HR 1 by the end of this calendar year, I believe, and so we have a timeline. In terms of tax conformity, I think that we would need to defer to our colleagues at the Department of Revenue to answer that question, but I do think that they know what the cost of that is.
Chair Torkelson, any follow-up?
Well, thank you. Thank you for that. I think we need to, as members of this body, need to have more information on those two areas because I know that they're going to be part of our conversation, and the numbers are large. The potential for withheld federal funds is huge if we don't do the work in the compliance area, and at the same time, the potential impact on our citizens by conforming to some of these tax policies would be very helpful for individual citizens, but of course, costly to the state budget. If I may, Mr. Chair.
Go ahead, Chair.
I don't, have you got other people on the
I do.
list? Well, I will pass now
Okay.
and come back if
We'll come
there's
back.
time.
We'll give you the last final word. Chair Vang. Chair Vang.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm looking at slide 20 here when the department implemented the new medical assistant prepayment review. I've gotten a lot of calls from providers and from even the workers themselves, how this has affected them. It's very worrisome when, of course, a provider is not being able to pay their staff, and the staff are also, many of them are working from paycheck to paycheck. And I just want to remind all of us as we look into savings, that we are very mindful of the real impact and consequences that it affects the workers and the care that they give to vulnerable communities. The worker that called me, she said that she needed help with rental assistance because she wasn't paid to be able to afford rent. And many, this is just one of few examples, of things that could pay for their gas or putting food on the table, caring for their kids. These are very real consequences. So just want all of us to be mindful of, as we look into savings, that we don't take from people that are struggling to make ends meet.
Thank you for that, Chair Vang. Chair Bierman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have two questions. One, back to the compliance issue. First, wondering if the Medicaid provisions that we need to comply to in HR 1, do we actually have all the guidelines for doing so?
Director Mingy.
Mr. Chair, Chair Bierman, no, we do not have complete federal guidance on the provisions that we would need to sort of come into alignment with this session. That is something that we may not have until even early this summer. So I believe the Department of Human Services is trying to identify an implementation plan that would allow us to work towards that January 1 date in recognition of sort of a lack of information.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Bierman,
Thank
any
you.
more?
That's obviously problematic with our schedule, first, I will say. Secondly, I wanted to just ask about the general fund reserves. Could you elucidate a little bit more about the possibility or the difficulty of using reserve funds to backfill anything with Medicaid?
Commissioner.
Mr. Chair, Representative Bierman, the state statute says that the reserve can be used in the event of an unexpected downturn in revenues in the biennium that we are in. The loss of federal funds does not count as a loss of revenue. We would, absent a change to statute, we would not be able to use the reserve to backfill federal funding losses. I think that's
Mr. Chair, thank you.
Follow-up.
That's kind of what I was just wondering. We would have to actually act to be able to use some of that for a one-time expenditure toward that if we so choose. Is that what I'm hearing?
Mr. Chair, Representative Bierman, yes.
And Mr. Chair, just comment, but I certainly realize the downside of our AAA bond rating by doing such a thing, because the numbers I've seen about potential backfilling of Medicaid, even just this year, is enormous. Thank you.
Thank you. Chair Joachim.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I thought I'd pipe up real quick about the special education cost. Just, could you remind me if, when you factor into us paying out the cross-subsidy and sped, was that part of the increase? Because that's something we just started in '23 and '24.
Director Mingy.
Mr. Chair, Representative Joachim, the growth year over year reflects the growth in the cross-subsidy reduction aid. It will grow to 50% by fiscal year 2027, but it is not part of that sort of forecast to forecast change because it's sort of baked into the previous numbers.
Chair Yukin.
Mr. Chair, thank you. That's what I thought. Also, just remind me, I know that one of the three growth areas we tried to tackle last year with the growth in the reimbursement rate on transportation billing. And if I can remember right, we cut it by 5% and then 10%, which should be in the coming year. So is this forecast, can we break that out and see how much that is changing the forecast just in that transportation piece and get it to me later?
Director Mingy.
Yep. Mr. Chair, Representative, yes, we'll break that out and follow up.
Any follow-up, Chair? Chair Mola.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I am looking at slide 21, and I have a question, although it maybe isn't directly in the slide. We hear a lot about how Minnesota is a donor state to the federal government and that we pay more in federal taxes than we receive back in revenue. I'm seeing a recent article that has that number at about $44 billion, and I'm just curious if you know if that is the right amount.
Director Mingy. Or Commissioner.
Mr. Chair, Representative Mueller, I think we'll have to follow up with you on that.
Chair Mola, any follow-up?
Yeah, that would be great. Thank you. And I guess, just thinking about the fact that Minnesota is a donor state to the federal government, looking at the loss of federal funding that we are at least being threatened of receiving. We had the administration mentioning retribution against Minnesota. And now we also know that HR 1 is very damaging to our state, as we talked about on our side throughout the 2025 session, and now that day is here. And so just a comment reflecting on where we are and how frustrating that is, especially in light of the fact that we are a net donor to the federal government. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair Mola. Chair Cagle.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I'm looking at slide 13. We know that, the top 10% hold 93% of stocks and mutual funds. Do we have any numbers of how many Minnesotans are actually participating in the S&P 500?
What? Dr. Becker?
Yes, thank you, Chair Frazier. Representative, we don't have that information exactly, but I've done some analysis in preparation for these sorts of questions. And one of the things that we do have access to is Internal Revenue Service analysis of federal tax returns filed by Minnesota residents. One of the striking things is how the sources of income vary in the top 10% by income of households from the next 10% and the 10% below that and so forth. For example, in the top 10%, wages and salaries are only roughly about 30% of total income, and capital gains are over 20%, whereas in the 8th decile, so people in the 70s roughly, capital gains are approximately 5%, and wages and salaries are over 70%. And if you move down to the 5th decile and the 8th decile, and the 2nd decile, the proportion in wages and salaries stays relatively constant. So the term about the K-shaped economy, about how people in the top end of the income distribution are experiencing things differently, a lot of that is the effect of capital gains, also, mutual fund, brokerage account, and so forth, changing the income profile of people who are heavily invested in those areas.
Chair Cagle, any follow-up?
Yeah, and does that, I'd really like to see those numbers excluding the 401Ks too, to see how many people actually are participating in the market. And so I'm just kind of curious about how this benefits like working Minnesotans, and how is this trickling down?
Dr. Becker?
Thank you, Chair Frazier. Representative, in terms of how it is trickling down or how it's benefiting other people in the income distribution, I really can't speak to that. My focus at this point was, I did this analysis really for the focus on the volatility of state revenues. So I haven't explored the other issues.
One last.
Chair Cagle, go ahead.
Thank you. And then I was just really curious about the percentage of our taxpayer dollars that are going out to contracts and private entities versus the amount of our tax dollars that are going to state assets and public sector labor. Do you have any of that information at all?
Commissioner?
Chair Frazier, Representative Cagle, I think that we'll have to follow up with you on that. We certainly would be able to tell you how much of any budget, any annual budget or biennial budget is going to pay like state employee salaries versus what is going out and, through like grants or contracts, those types of things. But we'd need to spend a little time with that.
Thank you.
Chair Gomez?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I'm looking at the revenue forecast, of course, is of particular interest to me on page 14. $2.5 billion more collections in income than we thought we were going to see a year ago. $500 million more collections in corporate than we thought we were going to see a year ago. And so, what this speaks to is the dynamic that we all know is at play in our country and that we see kind of bubbling up in our politics and in our work over and over again, right? Which is that we have a dynamic in our country where corporate entities, billionaires, multimillionaires get ever richer. They get rich on government contracts, they get rich on tax cuts, and the middle class has been hollowed out. And working class people are having a harder and harder time just paying their bills every month, paying their rent every month. These dynamics are not disconnected from the decisions that we make in this body. Non-wage income, I'm very glad that Representative Cagle asked about this. Because this is the kind of stuff that most of us will never, ever see a cent of in our lives. Capital gains, interest, dividends, royalties, annuities. These are like foreign languages to most people that we represent. And, the untold story about that is that those are realizations of gains, right? If you're a smart, rich person, like President Trump said he was, you're a sucker if you ever pay a tax in your life. Because the thing that you do if you're a smart, rich person is you purchase assets, you borrow against them instead of taking an income from them, instead of selling something and realizing a gain, which gets you a tax benefit. If you borrow against an asset, you get a deduction for that on your taxes. And then when you die and you've lived off of of borrowing against your assets, the asset with its increased value gets passed on to your heirs and heiresses, and nobody ever pays the tax on that. It's called buy, borrow, die. That's how smart, rich people roll. And so seeing $3 billion, right, of increased revenue collection, that means that is like the tip of the iceberg of the benefits that have accrued to the wealthiest in our society and continue to at this just astonishing rate. These are the beneficiaries of the government's largesse. These are the beneficiaries of our tax dollars. Because like Martin Luther King Jr., I believe, said it best. It was like, in this country, there's socialism for the rich and rugged individualism for the poor. If you're a rich person or a corporation that needs a contract or a tax cut, then it's line up at the trough. If you are a poor child who needs health care, what did this government just say to them? Figure it out. Deal with it yourself. Socialism for the rich, rugged individualism for the poor. That's like what is reflected in this report. And it's what was reflected in the decisions that were made by our federal government in H.R. 1. And so I know that, Chair Torkelson doesn't sit on taxes, unfortunately. We want him there, of course. But this discussion about tax conformity, which is going to be something that we're going to be like, oh, this is just this neutral alignment of our tax code with the federal tax code. We must do it in order to make it easy for us to administrate it, administrate the code. We must, just align with those changes that were made in H.R. 1 so that it doesn't make it complex for taxpayers, for filers, right? The taxpayers who are most impacted by that have the most expensive accountants in the state. The beneficiaries of H.R. 1 are going to be just fine with a little bit of complication added to filing their taxes. Because I am going to insist that in this conversation about tax conformity, we do not forget who were the winners and losers of H.R. 1, who are the winners and losers in our economy, and who has won and lost as a result of these decisions that are made. So the benefits of H.R. 1 flow disproportionately since they're mostly a continuation of the 2017 TCJA, and we all can see those analyses are almost 10 years old now. And what we know is that that was a massive redistribution of wealth from the poor to the rich. That was the impact of the TCJA. That is what every analysis of H.R. 1 says is going to happen when it's fully implemented. That the tax breaks and the goodies all go to those who already have a lot, and that the cuts to health care are going to hit low-income kids, elders, people with disabilities, that the unwillingness to renew even the tax subsidies for the ACA will hit small businesses and farmers in particular who have to buy their insurance on the exchange. And those of us who are lucky enough to be provided with employer health insurance, because this is a one system, we'll also see all of our costs going up and up and up. The cost of that administration is going to go on to counties in Minnesota because we fully delegate that responsibility to them. We restrict how counties are able to raise money. So we're talking about probably across the state, hundreds of millions of dollars of increases in property taxes because of this, so that the non-wage earners could invest more heavily in the stock market. And so as we're deciding about tax conformity, as we're talking about this budget, we're not going to forget what this actually is in front of us. Which is a bill that reflects values like all bills do. And the value that you see reflected in H.R. 1, the pieces of which we're going to be picking up as state lawmakers, are that we should have socialism for the rich and rugged individualism for the poor. And we have to reject that formulation and understand that we have a role in helping our economy go a different way and in helping our state go a different way. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Chair Gomez. Chair Olson.
Oh, thanks. I got promoted. I'm actually not a chair, but thank you.
You're welcome.
So I appreciate
You're
it.
welcome.
I'm doing the best I can now. So I think that was a really eloquent pontification from the chair of the tax committee, talking about conforming our taxes with the federal governments and how, the richest and the poorest and all these conversations that we regularly hear. I heard this same presentation. I think I took a different understanding of it. I think the understanding is that we are bringing in far more money than what we should. We need to cut our spending, absolutely. A structural imbalance is always a problem. But when we're looking at $3 billion in a surplus right now, I think the conversation needs to go around conforming to the federal government's tax rates, because we're looking at it and we're saying, I don't know how many of the richest Minnesotans made their riches off of taxes on tips and on overtime. I am very confident that the vast majority of Minnesotans, our wealthiest Minnesotans, did not make their money off of taxing tips and on taxing overtime. So I hope that as we're moving forward, talking about taxes, talking about conforming to the federal government's tax policies, that we take that into account. That a significant portion of Minnesotans earn their living off of taxes on, or earn their living off of tips and on overtime, and that's where a lot of their wealth is generated, and that we shouldn't be taxing those. So I hope we do have a great lengthy conversation on the conformity to the federal government's taxes, and I hope that we choose to make that happen, because the richest among us are not getting paid off of tips and overtime.
Representative Baji.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I won't take too long. We do have a better forecast in front of us than what we had originally anticipated. And while very mindful of the structural needs in the future, I wanted to just make sure, and others have said this too, but I also want us to, as we continue to have our conversations of what a budget should look like, is really consider any cuts that we decide to do or any offsetting of costs, who do those fall on? And oftentimes when we do that in this body, they tend to fall on people who are already suffering, are already having to pay their own way, already having to figure out how to struggle, how to pay for food, pay for healthcare, pay for housing. And so we have an opportunity here to continue in investing in what supports working Minnesotans, what supports people who are living paycheck to paycheck. And so I hope that in our conversations, we keep them front and center, especially as we are facing cuts and closures, particularly in our healthcare system, and how to deal with that. And try not to just focus on how we just limit services, but rather how do we ensure that whatever sacrifices we have to make in Minnesota are actually being spread across to all Minnesotans. So thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Chair Pinto.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. A couple of questions for the state economist related to tariffs in particular. So you were saying that the forecast did not take into account the Supreme Court opinion. I was trying to sort of work my way through, but can you just talk about sort of what the current forecast we're seeing takes into account in terms of tariffs, and then what sort of the Supreme Court ruling, et cetera, would have an impact on that?
Dr. Becker.
Yes, Chair Frazier, thank you. Representative, yes, so the forecast assumption, well, in November, the forecast assumption was 18% effective tariff rate, which the effective tariff rate is the total tariff revenue divided by the total value of imports declared. The effective tariff rate was assumed to drop to 14% in the most recent forecast, and that was produced before the Supreme Court's opinion invalidating well over half the tariffs which were passed under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or IEPA. The administration responded immediately to that by announcing 10% tariffs under the Trade Act of 1974, Section 122. There was some uncertainty about whether they would be 10% or 15%, but Customs and Border Protection says they are 10%. Those are going to probably roughly equalize the amount of effective tariff reduction that the invalidation put in place. But of course, those tariffs are supposed to be justified under a balance of payment system, which goes back to fixed exchange rates, which we no longer have. And as I understand, that's going to be one of the principal court challenges, but those things are going to take time. Also, those tariffs are only effective for 150 days. Long story short, we're going to see a lot more variability in tariffs over the next year, certainly. But it's very difficult to forecast what the net effect is going to be.
Chair Pinto, any follow-up?
Yeah, I do, Mr. Chair. And so, Dr. Becker, is it, just as a general matter, is it the case that sort of as we have higher tariffs, we can expect lower economic growth? Obviously, there's a lot of detail in there, but in terms of sort of the impact on the forecast, is that something, I mean, and I'm comparing to a certain extent to immigration. You talked about as that federal immigration actions could result in workforce shortages in certain sectors. I heard you said that. Can you talk about the impact of higher tariffs as a general matter on the economic forecast?
Dr. Becker.
Thank you, Chair. Frazier. Representative, as a general matter, the effect of higher tariffs is to cause higher consumer prices because the imported goods become more expensive for the most part by the amount of the tariff, or very close to it. 90% or above of the tariff is passed through. Domestic vendors then match the higher international prices, and so it's not that you can then substitute to domestic goods, because if you've ever lived in a place with tariffs, as I have, you know that the principal effect is that the tariffs get passed on, and the domestic producers also take advantage of the higher prices. So it's not necessarily higher sustained inflation, but there would be, as the tariffs are implemented, a step up in prices, which means that the inflation occurs with the imposition of the tariffs, but then doesn't get higher later. The forecast by SPGMI showed easing inflation because they assumed that tariffs would be coming down in 2026. That's now uncertain. I hope I've answered your questions.
I think, Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, and final comment. Yeah, I think that you did, Dr. Becker. It's hard for me to look at the full presentation and not draw the conclusion that the biggest threat to our state budget in the long run are the actions of the Trump administration. And let me walk through that. We know the president's been pushing for higher tariffs, which, as you said, lead to higher prices. We know that our constituents are have been feeling the push of higher prices and continue to, despite the president insisting that would not be happening. We know that the tariffs are a threat. We know the immigration actions are a threat. Dr. Becker, you referenced workforce shortages in certain sectors. We know that the federal funds, which have been addressed by a number of members, including Chair Moeller, as being a threat there. I'm looking at slide 16, talking about the forecast risks, and this reference to missing and incomplete statistical agency data, which is a narrow concern, a very specific one for us. But to my mind, it's just part of a broader set of risks, which have to do with the rule of law and sort of the reliability that, in fact, our government is producing accurate information that we can all act upon, and that even that court orders are going to be followed. That's the kind of uncertainty that causes all sorts of problems. I will note that we have not even referenced the fact, I assume the forecast doesn't take into account, that we're in the middle of a war in the Middle East right at the moment, and that obviously adds uncertainty as well. I know that we're thinking of our service members who've lost their lives. And overall, you talk about policy uncertainty, the volatility and the erratic nature of the Trump administration's actions. The actions we can count on are ones that are destructive to our state, and then there's lots of actions we can't count on because there's a lot of volatility and erratic behavior. So adding all of these things up, we have a significant risk coming out of the Trump administration for our state, and I would hope we all can come together to urge the federal government to help us rather than harming us in all these variety of ways. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Chair Pinto. Chair Torks, I'm going to give you the last word, but I'm going to make a couple of comments before that. Members, thank you for the robust conversation. Commissioner, thank you. And Director, thank you. And State Economist Dr. Becker, thank you for the presentation. I do want to say this was a very robust conversation, so I appreciate members for being so engaged on this. I will remind us, we have an opportunity, and a great opportunity, and we're privileged to be here in these seats. But in this moment, with the uncertainty that we have around the country, definitely around the world, actually, with the uncertainty in the economy situation that we have, we are the guardians. We are the guardians at the gate. And what we do, we have to center those that are among the least of us to ensure that we're taking care of everyone in the state of Minnesota. And I believe everyone at this table wants to do that. So I appreciate the robust conversation. Chair Torkelson, if you want the final words and a preview for next week.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. We could spend a lot more time here today if we chose to. I'll delay the rest of the questions I had and go to my closing remarks. You mentioned guardians at the gate, but what we haven't talked about here today is the extensive fraud in the state of Minnesota. Very little of it is reflected in this forecast. I believe that if the commitment to address fraud is as universal as it appears to be, because I've heard the governor speak about fraud, I've heard the other leaders of the Democrat Party speak about fraud, there's a potential there for us to significantly reduce state spending without hurting anyone who doesn't deserve to be hurt, frankly. And we need to do that. And Guardians at the Gate also wouldn't blow an $18 billion surplus on many programs that we're still trying to figure out what they did. And in fact, there's a lot of money that remains unspent from those efforts, and we'll be looking at that closely. I just think that we need to focus on the things that we can make a difference on. It sounds like there's a number of folks in this room that want to run for Congress. Go right ahead. I ran for the state house, and I want to do the work of the state, and I want to make sure that we put our state on a footing that we can move forward successfully. I think it's good news that this forecast is better. I agree with the uncertainty, however. There's lots of uncertainty out there. We must be cognizant of that and avoid taking chances at this point in time with our funds. But the fact that the economy is doing better than expected is something we should all be appreciative of. It's a good thing. And when somebody works hard in their lifetime, pays for some things and builds up some assets, that's not a bad thing. That's rewarding good behavior. That's what we should all strive for. I'm very frustrated today, Mr. Chair, but that's the nature of our work. I do appreciate your leadership, Mr. Chair, and I look forward to our next meeting. I'm just going to highlight that briefly. We're going to be focusing on the software that we use here in the state of Minnesota and that our counties use to implement a variety of programs, and the variety is extensive, by the way. But we are going to take a look at what work we did last year, see how that's going, and try to identify what work we can do this year to set us up for success. If we're going to effectively address fraud in this state, we've got to have the data and the ability to do it with the programs that operate and make these programs, these services function. And I'm hoping we can move forward with that, and we'll get a good illustration of that next week. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Chair, thank you for those words. I agree. We should effectively address fraud and hold people accountable. And I'm not sure who's running for Congress. I was looking around, so I don't know if you gave a reveal, but whoever it is, good luck on your endeavors. And with that, I adjourn.